Good morning. So I'm here with Nick Timothy, who's the former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Theresa May, to discuss his book, Remaking One Nation, The Future of Conservatism. Now, since leaving government, Nick, you've been writing for the Daily Telegraph, and you've also been spending time in academia at the University of Sheffield and the University of Oxford. And I think this perhaps explains why this book is a bit unusual. And it's not really the sort of book by former politicians or former senior advisors. It's not really in that genre. There is a little bit of telling your own version of events and spilling some beans in the first part, but really the focus of the book is a reflection about ideas, political, economic, philosophical, that should guide a reform of conservatism. And I think all the accolades from various impressive intellectuals and academics, from John Gray to Maurice Glassman and Robert Toombs, show that this is a serious intellectual book. It isn't either the kind of book about ideas that sometimes politicians or former politicians treat us to, where there is a bit of hopey changey, make the world a better place kind of thing. This is serious. There's the whole landscape of liberal and conservative thought of the last few centuries that you engage with. And I imagine that over the last 2 years, and this could be a question to get us started, over the last 2 years, you must have been doing quite a lot of reading, going back to the classics of political thought.
Yeah, I suppose in the book I do talk a little bit about my experience in government, and the experience in government informs some of what I say, which, you know, as you just said, does take in kind of philosophy and I hope empirical research and policy, and I think. You know, leaving government, and especially leaving government in the way that I did, which was not especially happy, it creates space for you to really think about what you got right, what you got wrong. It gives you the chance, I think, to think differently to how people in the thick of day-to-day politics and government life, they don't have the freedom and the time to think too deeply. So yeah, I spent a year as a visiting fellow at Oxford. I'm a visiting professor at Sheffield as well, and I went and spoke and had pretty good conversations with some very impressive thinkers in their different fields, and read quite widely. And the book is. It's consistent, I think, with the things that I've believed for quite a long time, and I think with some of the things I tried to achieve in government. But I hope it's deeper in its analysis and therefore more considered in its recommendations.
Yes. Can you tell us what ultraliberalism is? This is the sort of bête noire in the book is ultraliberalism, and I think those who will follow us will get a sense really of your main argument if you tell us a bit more about liberalism.
Yeah, the ultra-liberals are the bogeyman. I think what I'm trying to do with the book is to look at where we are today and the policies that have got us to where we are, but then to look at the kind of philosophical assumptions that lie behind those policies. And I think quite often our politicians some of them are pretty ideological. Lots of them deny they're ideological, but they are actually influenced by philosophy and political ideas in ways that sometimes they may not even realize. And I suppose to some degree the book is a critique of liberalism itself. And liberalism is, when you talk about liberalism, it can be a bit of a nightmare because it can mean absolutely anything at all. So what I try to do in the book is produce some definitions. So I say that we should imagine kind of concentric circles. So at the core, you've got essential liberalism, which is the sort of liberal beliefs that I think almost everybody in the West, apart from some sort of minority of extremists, would accept. So the sort of institutions and the checks and balances that make liberal democracy work, sort of free media, free courts, bicameral parliament, individual rights to protect minorities, and a free economy. But then there's a sort of second sort of circle, which I call elite liberalism, where you have views that are kind of shared among the governing classes and some of the elite institutions of the country, regardless of party political background. So you tend to have a support for high immigration, for a largely unregulated labour market. So George Osborne, Nick Clegg, Tony Blair all belong to different political parties, but really they probably subscribe to those kinds of beliefs, and they're often beliefs that aren't really shared by majorities of voters. But it's not enough to just say, oh, there's this elite liberal consensus, because then there's another circle, which I call ultraliberalism, and there's this sort of ultraliberal ratchet where left and right have different liberalizing agendas. So on the right, you have sort of market fundamentalism, where people want to sort of marketize all public services, want to deregulate the economy. And on the left, you have cultural liberals who increasingly push this agenda of militant identity politics. And what tends to happen is the two sides, they try to do different things, but they rarely actually repeal the reforms of the other side. When they get into power, they then press ahead with their own kind of liberalizing policies. So you have this kind of left-right ratchet effect. And the result is we have a society where there's a lot of atomization, there's a lot of social dislocation, there are sort of profound social and economic effects of things like the deindustrialization that we've seen over our lifetimes. And then perversely for people, the sort of ultraliberals of the right, you quite often end up with this kind of growing state that is trying to put sticking plasters on the problems that ultraliberalism has brought about.
Yes. And when do you think ultraliberalism took shape? You say the 1960s and the 1980s were different for, respectively, the ultraliberalism of the left and the ultraliberalism of the right. But when did it become such a coherent political force?
Well, I think I think writers who have identified these problems refer to the sort of social liberal revolution of the 60s, the economic revolution of the 80s under Mrs. Thatcher, and I think those things are right. But I think you probably also need to take a kind of longer look at it, but also a shorter one. So in terms of the longer sweep, which is one of the things I try to do in the book, you have to go back to liberal philosophers and try to understand why there might be flaws in some of those original liberal ideas. So I talk about the state of nature theorists and the way in which they imagine the state of nature, a life without any kind of government at all, which is unpleasant, it's violent, it's insecure and poor. And so people come together and they form a social contract where they decide what powers the state should have and what rights they should have. But of course, the state of nature never existed. And in creating this model, which is effectively what it is, you're sort of baking sort of flawed assessments about humanity into your philosophy. So it's assumed that we are all autonomous, rational, always trying to maximize our own sense of freedom. And it completely ignores things like historical or cultural context, which creates this kind of universalism in liberalism. And so you can sort of see how these things then apply themselves to both cultural liberalism and economic liberalism. So, for example, you could take immigration as an issue, where actually, from an economic perspective or from a cultural perspective, quite often we treat countries like they're pretty much a platform in which anybody can come and live, and their lifestyle would be the same as if it was anywhere else, because the judgment is is that the kind of cultural context of a country, its institutional frameworks and so on, don't really matter. We're the same everywhere, the world over. We're uninfluenced by the societies that I think shape us, and that's why we end up with some pretty flawed policies. And so, if you then, that's the sort of longer sweep. If you think about the sort of the shorter view, well, I suppose the 60s and the 80s were the periods where these two things really started to come about. But I think maybe the sort of the 90s and the 2000s, right up until now, the period when it's really sort of where the fire has really started to burn, where we've had governments that have, I think, quite often actually pursued both economic and cultural liberalism at the same time.
Yes, yes. I was wondering about the 90s. In my work on international law and international ideas, it does seem to have been quite a critical era in a number of ways. For example, in 89, 1990, there were all of these international lawyers, international relations theorists saying, well, this is a great new era for democracy. People thought that the whole UN system would move towards a greater endorsement of the principle of democracy. And after all, in the UN Charter, there are references to self-determination, which can quite easily be seen as already supporting some idea of democracy. But that's not what happened. We very quickly forgot about democracy. We certainly didn't put the democratic ideal at the center of the new world order that emerged from the end of the Cold War. And instead it was economic globalization, technocracy, supranationalism. It was another baggage of ideas, which I suppose you would associate with ultraliberalism, that ended up shaping that post-Cold War world order. And democracy, which had been the triumphant idea, was almost forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to say about that, I think. I mean, firstly, this idea that sort of 1989 heralded the end of history, and that, liberal democracy was the kind of sort of constitutional ideal, and that every country in the world was going to move towards that. I mean, you can sort of see that in the kind of old ideas that I've talked about. So we've already talked about universalism, but there's this sense also in liberalism, I think, where of inevitable progress. So liberalism quite often, stands for pluralism, and that's obviously a very welcome thing. It's basically a recognition of the fact that societies have different values and interests, and we need to find ways of managing conflicts between those values and interests. But some liberal thinkers tend to justify pluralism as a means towards progress, because it allows for effectively a kind of trial and error in societies, which, combined with our rationalism, lead to an ever more perfect society. And that's what quite often makes liberalism actually illiberal, as it becomes, its sense of progress quite often means that it becomes intolerant of people who disagree about what that progress means. Because if it is the trial and error of a pluralistic society combined with rationality that gives us progress, if somebody disagrees with what that sense of progress is, then by definition, according to this logic, you're being irrational. You're sort of clinging to these sort of old ways of life.
Deplorable, to call
I'm sorry?
You're deplorable.
Yeah, exactly. You might be you're one of the basket of deplorables, and so it can become quite illiberal. And I think this sort of sense of inevitable progress and universalism is what gets us into trouble in international relations all the time. So the West has, over the last few decades, just assumed that at the end of the Soviet Union, free markets, privatization, and the odd democratic vote would make Russia some kind of Scandinavian ideal, which obviously didn't happen. We've bombed Gaddafi out of power in Libya. We've gone into Iraq and Afghanistan. which obviously have ended quite unhappily. We've allowed China into the WTO, and we were told that there was nothing to worry about. They wouldn't abuse international trading laws, that their society would become more liberal and more open and more tolerant. And obviously those things haven't happened either. And we're incredibly naive about the way we approach these things on the world stage, I think because of this combination of universalism and this idea of progress, because the assumption is that the rest of the world want to be just like us and will inevitably do so. But with all of the examples I just went through, that those assumptions have been proved wrong.
Yes, and perhaps another assumption that crystallized in the 1990s within the ultra-liberal sphere was the sense that it's all about the free market, which curiously enough, is a bit of a Marxist idea. The idea that economic relations are all that matter and everything else is determined by what happens in the market. And if you change the market, you've changed everything, is a Marxist idea that somehow this new liberal consensus of the 90s embraced. And those two key decisions, monetary union in Europe and China in the WTO, were both premised on the idea, well, if you change market relations, politics will follow. And it hasn't quite worked out that way, has it?
Yeah, I think I like that comparison with Marxism. I think it is also connected to to these mistakes within liberalism as well, though, because it's connected to this idea that freedom is the sort of singular value, the most important value in human relations, and freedom is obviously an important value, but it's not the only value that is important to us. We have other values like justice or security or solidarity and a sense of a need for certain kinds of equality, and I think it's this mistaken assumption that freedom is the most important human value that leads to this kind of attitude that the market must always be the solution to everything, because only the market can provide for the choices of individuals. So whether it's I'm digressing slightly, but if you think about the way in which economic liberals think about things like the National Health Service, well, the assumption is that no model can provide for efficiency, but also individual choices like a market. But actually, all countries, and Britain in particular, with the National Health Service model, put other values into their considerations for designing their health systems. They think too about equality and solidarity, and so forgive me for that digression, but I think the emphasis on economics and on markets come from this view about the importance of freedom, but it's not individual freedom that drives decision making by the Chinese state, for example, and yet I think the thinking among liberals has always been that because individuals are sort of freedom seekers who want to sort of maximize their sense of freedom, they always they think in sort of in economic terms, and those economic freedoms will lead to social freedoms, which is not something that's been borne out by history, and certainly not over the last few decades.
Yes, and it's an impoverished idea of freedom as well that they seem to be centered on. It isn't quite the richer idea of freedom that takes into account human experience and human aspirations in their context, in their complexity, in their conflicts as well. It's this idea of these monads who are efficiency seekers and just operate almost like algorithms rather than human beings with their complexity. And maybe there's something that also happened in economics, which at some point stopped being political economics and just became a bit of a drier subject that removed the experience of the market from the wider social political context.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a clear relationship between the sort of the sense of the individual from the state of nature theorists through to the way the individual is conceived in economic modelling now. The sort of the econ who is it's just not a real person, I think there's a lot more complexity in what we're talking about, like in the real world, compared to sort of what we're talking about. So, in a strong society and in a good lived life, it is our sort of the restrictions on our freedom that actually end up quite often making us more free anyway. It is the sort of the bonds that we impose on ourselves, either by entering into families and making sacrifices for our partners or our children, or our commitments to, broadly speaking, do right by other members of our society, that enable us to actually live quite freely anyway.
And to flourish as human beings.
Exactly.
Yes. There's another distinction in the history of liberalism that perhaps is relevant to this, and it's between different liberal traditions in Europe. There is a certain Anglo-American tradition of liberalism that perhaps over time came up with this conception of the individual as removed from any historical experience, identity, beliefs. Although, to be fair, the classical liberalism of, say, an Adam Smith would not really have is not really guilty of that sin. I think it's still a very humanist idea of freedom. But the French liberal tradition, and you mentioned Constant in your book, but also perhaps especially Tocqueville, is very much premised on the idea of the individual and of freedom that you think should be at the heart of a liberal conservative project. Of human beings, not as abstractions, but in their world of complex social relations that have value and meaning for them. And so they shouldn't be seen as hindrances to freedom, that the sooner they're removed, the better, but they should be part of the free, meaningful experience of human beings in society.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, I am largely influenced by the kind of Anglo-American liberal traditions, and I think that is mainly what I've written about in the book. And I think, sort of transferring this to sort of politics and policy, you can actually, you can see quite sharp differences in the nature of sort of conservative or centre-right politics in a country like Germany to Britain and America. And while I tend to be reluctant to argue that you can just take a particular sort of political tradition or set of policies from one country and just drop them into another, because cultural context really matters. I suppose if you were sort of looking for a kind of lazy shorthand, I would think that some of what I say is an argument that conservatism needs to shed some of the kind of ideological liberalism that has influenced it over the last several decades, and to learn a little bit more from that kind of continental Christian democratic model.
Yes, yeah. And I think the other question that also came to mind reading your criticisms of ultraliberalism and listening to you now is what you said. In some ways they're becoming liberal, and there may be more than one way in which this ultraliberalism, this sort of extreme version of liberalism, becomes a negation of the very principles which it purports to affirm. There is an element of intolerance towards different opinions, towards different beliefs. There is less and less interest in free speech as a core value of a free society. There is less and less interest in democracy as the main way of deliberation. And also what has happened since the financial crisis is that this kind of ultra-liberal world perhaps doesn't care about the free market that much either, because the degree of intervention in the so-called free market are now so extensive that there are very few corners of it where we can really say that the market operates freely. And this is not to say that any kind of state intervention or state regulation makes the market unfree, but the nature of the interventions that we have seen have fundamentally made a number of key markets, from financial markets to the corporate bonds market, entirely unfree markets, markets where central banks determine the price, and so they're not free markets.
Yeah, and I think actually what's interesting is a lot of those interventions obviously work in the interests of the already rich and powerful. So I think some of the interventions, and in some cases policies that amount to non-intervention, that I talk about in the book are things like, the way in which housing policy in Britain works, which both the sort of the financing of housing, but also the construction market works in the interests of those who already hold significant assets. The policy of quantitative easing after the financial crash, might have been necessary medicine, but what it effectively did was inflate the value of assets, and it's effectively redistributed to the already rich. The same goes with various elements of taxation when it comes to things like the way pension savings are taxed. These are all sort of interventions and policy decisions that effectively work in the interests of the kinds of classes of people from which the decision makers come from.
Yes, and there is a great problem of fairness, obviously, with all of this, because if we now live in a situation where the Fed or the European Central Bank essentially determines the price of the bonds of big corporations, what is the moral argument that we can give to people who rent for saying the state is not going to determine the price of your rent because that has to be left to free market forces? Well, why should that be left to free market forces, whereas the price of corporate bonds is something that we've decided to interfere with? Now, the argument is, well, but the price of corporate bonds, by interfering with it and purchasing corporate bonds through central banks, we are essentially helping the economy overall. So even the person who's renting is somehow helped by this mechanism. But that's not entirely convincing, is it? Because the same could be said about rental market regulation.
Yeah, I mean, we're into a very interesting and quite complex period of politics now, I think, because actually policies like monetary easing, but also now with things like widespread furlough schemes around the West, actually play into pretty left-wing arguments about economics, as you say. So actually, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell used to say, well, if we've had QE for the banks, we can have a people's QE, and we can effectively print money that will facilitate sort of massive general public spending. I think the furlough scheme is now leading lots of people to say, well, if this is possible in a time of crisis like this, then why can't we have a universal basic income? And actually, I think for people on the centre right, it will be a challenge now to make conservative arguments about why those things aren't right or desirable. And that will sometimes be, I think, quite a complicated case to make. I mean, I think a universal basic income is wrong on several grounds. I think I think work is good for people in a kind of social sense, in a personal sense, and so on. But it's also there's also a question of efficiency. If you try to take existing spending on welfare and try to even it out into a universal single payment for everybody, then sure, you might find some efficiency savings, but it's going to be a less effective way of targeting people who really need the support. But you're into quite complicated arguments once you've conceded the principle that actually, in the form of something like QE, yes, you can print money for some people in some contexts. And in the case of furloughing, yes, you can pay lots of people not to work.
Yes. So we need to rethink the social contract in some ways and create different rules create a sense of fairness that is obviously being eroded since at least the financial crisis. What you say somewhere in the book that the real center in terms of public opinion is a bit more to the left on the state and the economy and a bit more to the right on cultural identity. And I think that's where you would broadly want to a center-right party or a conservative party to be. A number of center-left parties seem to be moving a bit in that direction too, aren't they? In Denmark, for example, and I think perhaps even here, Labour Party may slowly move slightly in that direction. What would differentiate at that point a social democratic party that has basically told the postmodernist identity warriors, go away, we're going back to being Peter Shaw, Clement Attlee type of social democrats, and a conservative party?
Well, I think, even if political parties converge on what might be considered a kind of new centre ground, there would still be plenty of scope to argue about policy. So actually, if Labour did start to become more communitarian in the sense that they were more sceptical about immigration, more pro-integration, more accepting of the fact that Brexit has been decided, tougher on law and order, and if the Conservatives moved slightly leftward in an economic direction, on economic matters, then there would still be plenty of scope to argue about, the applicability of human rights laws on one hand, or maybe sort of, the way in which we raise revenues through taxation. But I think the point about public opinion being slightly to the left on the economy and slightly to the right on culture and identity is a pretty important one, because and this is something that's driven me crazy for years, so it's good to get it off my chest, is this the language of the political centre is incredibly convenient for some people. So the political centre tends to be defined in three ways. It can be political and economic liberalism. It can be seen as political moderation, as defined by a kind of centre point between the positions adopted by those on the right and on the left. And it can be taken to mean broadly where moderate public opinion is. But it can't be all three of those things at any one time. And yet in political debate, that is what tends to happen. So, you tend to have a kind of BBC worldview or a Times columnist worldview where they will elide those three things together all the time, and they're rarely challenged on it. And it's very convenient if you're a political and economic liberal, and you'll refer to yourself as a centrist. It's very convenient to just assert that the political centre is, by definition, moderate and where the mainstream of public opinion is, but it's not true.
It's self-referential.
Very self-referential.
Yes. You also say something at some point in the book, although it isn't one of the main themes, about the problems that you had with the media world during your time in government and with the BBC. And that got me to think about another important aspect of this whole discussion, which is really the quality of the public sphere, because inevitably there is a correlation between the two. If the public sphere and the debates that we have in the public sphere are of a 3 out of 10 quality, at the best of times, you can hope for a government that is 4 or 5 out of 10, but they're not going to be much better than the public sphere that, after all, in a democracy generates government in a number of ways. Do you share the sense that the public sphere, the quality of the debates, the way in which questions are put, the way in which arguments are pursued in the public has deteriorated over the last few years? Or is that a myth?
No, I think it's probably true. I mean, I think some of this is a hangover from the kind of 90s and 2000s, where there was definitely a period where it felt like, and politicians behaved as though ideology had ended. This is connected to the kind of end of history mentality that we talked about earlier, where it felt like there were few security threats. The world was just getting more peaceful. It felt like actually economic growth just kept coming, and we didn't really have to worry too much about how we raised revenues through taxation. We didn't have to worry too much, therefore, about public spending and so on. So we lived through this sort of period where it felt like there weren't really difficult decisions to be made, and so I think politics just got a little bit frivolous. So I remember, I'm quoting a comedy, but I remember in the thick of it, there was a line given by the government spin doctor after a reshuffle where he said, "Remember, the line is more women than ever and a lower average age than the AC Milan defence," which was quite a funny joke given the age of the AC Milan defence at that time. But that kind of summed up that period, I think, and we're still living with some of those consequences now, where I think our approach to things like international development spending is incredibly naive, for example. But that international development policy was set in that period. The same about the way in which we've just continuously run down our defense capabilities. We are learning right now, especially as China is changing its strategy as the world is distracted with the virus, that many of the old rules still apply. The world is a dangerous place, and you need power to be able to defend your values and interests around the world. And if you think about the debates we've had in British politics over the last week or so, we are dealing with an incredibly serious pandemic. At the same time, China is crushing Hong Kong, making threatening noises about Taiwan. It's continuing to expand its facilities in the South China Sea. It's getting more aggressive to the West. And we're arguing about personality politics. And there isn't that. I don't think there has been a really serious debate about things like Hong Kong, either in our virtual or non-virtual parliament, or really in our media. Yes. And I think I sometimes think we don't behave like a serious country, and that really needs to change.
Yes, there is this sense, and again, I don't know exactly when it took shape, but there is this sense that the role of a journalist is almost like that of a prosecutor, of holding villain politicians to account. It isn't the pursuit of the truth. It isn't establishing facts. It isn't distinguishing fact between opinion. It is just this very personal prosecutorial drive to demonstrate that the person who's answering questions as minister or whatever is a villain. And I don't know whether that started with Iraq in this country. I can't quite recall. I came to this country a bit before Iraq. I remember, I have to say, a bit of that already in 96, 97, around the final 2 years of the Conservative government. But it seems to be only that now is interest the general media in terms of creating debate, just that sort of quite stale narrative. Journalists ask difficult questions, politician is a bit of a villain and is not telling it as it is.
Well, I mean, look, politicians definitely need to be accountable, and that should mean really robust journalism. But I think, I agree with what you say. If you start off with the mentality of I'm the chief prosecutor, yeah. Then you've already assumed that the politician is guilty. And actually, there is a case for prosecutors in the media. There's a case for serious investigations, and actually, the decline of media finances over the years has meant that actually there's less scope for serious long-term investigations now, which is I think, a problem. But ultimately, newspapers and the media are there to report the news. And I think increasingly, for some journalists, they don't actually think that that's their role. I remember talking to one journalist several years ago where I committed the sin of referring to his job as reporting news, and he told me that's not what I do. And I said, I don't understand. I thought that's what your job as a journalist meant. And he said, no. He said, if you think about it, in Westminster and Whitehall, there are thousands and thousands of decisions being made every week and month. And it's too complex to just report. So it's my job to create a narrative about what's happening so the public can understand what's going on. And I thought that was a really worrying comment, because I thought it really showed a kind of a delusion of grandeur and like almost a kind of God complex, because it is the job of the media to hold government to account, for sure, but it is the job to report news. It's not the job of the media to make news and to define events.
See, this is where perhaps that left-wing ultraliberalism, as you mentioned it, describe it in the book, may have played a role. And I thought it was quite interesting that you identified this connection between the postmodernists of the ultra-left and the ultra-liberals of the sort of George Osborne, Peter Mandelson consensus. Because there is that connection, I think. Politically, one would think of the former being ultra-left and the latter being centre, but actually they're much closer than they would seem to be, as things like the Brexit referendum shows. But all of a sudden, there's a big question. They all converge. And postmodernists were the ones who've been saying for decades, facts don't exist. It's all about discourse. It's all about narrative. And perhaps that ideology really has now shaped the way journalists think of themselves and of their work, because they're dismissive of facts, they're dismissive of news, and they think it's all about, as you said, as the journalist told you, the narrative.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's incredibly dangerous. I think this is one of the most intriguing questions I've kind of asked myself over the years, and actually, as a good example, we talked at the beginning about the freedom of leaving government, meaning that you have the time and space to think and go and have interesting conversations with impressive academics and to read and to just be a bit more inquisitive. And because it had always kind of bugged me, what is the intellectual origin of some of these kind of crazy things that we're describing? And I think I'm right in tracing a lot of the, especially militant identity politics, back to people like Foucault and postmodernists. And it was they who talked about discourse, as you say, and then it kind of leapt over the Atlantic, I think, to sort of American thinkers like Kimberly Crenshaw and others. And it's an incredibly insidious thing, isn't it? If discourse is oppressive, and if people don't understand the sort of the meaning of their words, and even the oppressed end up sort of reinforcing their own oppression through the sort of stories they tell about themselves, then it all ends up just feeling a little bit. I think that view of the world is very nihilistic, and if words themselves are an act of violence and oppression, then it doesn't take very much to justify violence in response to words. And I think that is what we're seeing on the liberal left, and that is then infecting sort of politics more broadly.
Yes. How do you think, and perhaps this could be our final question, because I think I've used up the time that we had. How do you think coronavirus will affect all of this, our politics, our public sphere?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of narrow British party politics, it's obviously given Keir Starmer a big opportunity to attack the government on the basis of competence, which he is already doing, and that will only grow, I think. But I think on a deeper level, I think it's definitely increasing people's sense of insecurity and fear, which is obviously not a good thing. But at the same time, it's I think we've had thousands upon thousands of people volunteering to support the NHS. We've had a Conservative government adopting policies that really, it really is active government, sort of massive interventions in the economy, both to keep people in work and to keep businesses alive. And you've got Conservative ministers talking about, this being a national collective effort, and talking up the role of the state as the only means by which we can overcome this threat. And I find it difficult to believe that with people feeling such insecurity and with policies that are so interventionist, and with this sense of sort of volunteering and the sort of idealization of the health service and health workers, it's very difficult to think that that after this, the government can go back to the politics and economics and language of individualism and liberalism. I think there's going to be significant demand on the state and a real need for a sense of solidarity in the country at large, but also in the policies of the government. I think we're moving in that direction anyway, where Boris's electoral pitch had been a bit more interventionist on the economy, and was certainly much more committed to higher public spending. So I would think that we are going to see the kind of politics that we're talking about, actually, where actually I think it is likely that economics will move slightly to the left, and I would think that on cultural matters, the government will stay probably where it is or move slightly to the right.
Yes. Do you think there might also be an element of intergenerational rebalancing, in the sense that we've asked a huge sacrifice for people under 40 who are objectively at very low risk in this crisis, and yet we're depriving them of education, of livelihoods. The sectors of the economy that are the most affected are those where younger people tend to work. I don't yet detect a sense of anger on the part of the young, but it wouldn't surprise me if, as things move forward, people begin to say, well, it's a huge ask that a certain generation has placed on us, and now we want something in return.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that I don't see any evidence of anger yet. You do see some people on the kind of ideological libertarian right making these kinds of arguments, but that's because I think a lot of those people are hugely frustrated by the policy of the lockdown.
Yeah.
But I don't. My sense is that is not where public opinion is. However, there are huge questions of intergenerational fairness. If we've seen stagnant incomes for working age adults for a decade or more. We're now about to experience unemployment, and I don't think we can expect strong wage growth for a period. And the working age population are going to be spending more and more through taxation on pension payments, on health and social care for the elderly, and I think the choices before us in terms of whether every one of the existing pensioner benefits should remain, or how it is that we will fund future increases in the health budget, or how it is that we will eventually and not before time try to fix social care. This question of intergenerational fairness, as we address those challenges, I think, will probably become more prominent.
Yes, I thought it was interesting to raise also because that's where the book starts, in a sense, with the whole social care in the 2017 manifesto, which was an attempt to deal with this problem. And it's very difficult for political electoral reasons that you're very well aware of.
It's hugely difficult because, I think lots of Western governments are having to grapple with this, but the old age dependency ratio is changing dramatically, as the baby boomer generation gets older. And we are, it's one of the reasons why I think tax rises in the end are inevitable, and anybody who thinks that we're going to have sustainable tax cuts, I think is being rather naive. The state is going to have to spend more money. It's going to have to raise more money, and with fewer workers relative to the number of elderly dependents, we're going to have to work out how we raise that money, and it takes you into difficult places, because I'm not sure it is fair to ask younger workers who have had stagnant incomes, who are finding it harder and harder to get onto the property ladder, who will be struggling to make savings for their own future pensions. It's going to be very hard to justify very significant tax rises on their income, which means that we're going to have to look at taxing, higher earners more, for sure, but there's obviously a limit to what that can raise. So we're probably also going to have to look at the balance between taxing wealth and income.
Yes. Great. Well, Nick, thank you very much. I think we've gone on for an hour. I didn't really realize time was going by, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.